Something shifted today that most news coverage is missing entirely. It's not the price of oil. It's not the latest casualty reports. It's not even that Israel is expanding strikes into Lebanon. It's one single sentence from Iran's own foreign ministry, and that sentence changes everything about how this ends. Iran acknowledged today that significant units of the Revolutionary Guard are no longer responding to the transitional government in Tehran. They are running on pre-programmed autonomous instructions, completely independent of civilian authority. Just let that sink in for a second. The military arm of a nuclear threshold state, which is right now in an active exchange with the United States and Israel, has decoupled from its own political leadership. This is not a tactical update. This is a structural fracture in the Iranian state. And it raises the one question that matters more than any other right now. If the people who are willing to negotiate don't control the people who are conducting the military response, what exactly is anyone negotiating with? We'll get to that. But first, let's establish what the markets already know that most headlines are missing. Brent crude oil hit $115 a barrel in the last 72 hours. That's a 28% jump since Friday. Most news coverage stops right there, but that's not the real pressure point. The real signal is in the insurance market. 3 major marine underwriters have already suspended all coverage for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. MSC, one of the world's largest shipping operators, has suspended all of its trans-Suez sailings. When institutional insurers withdraw their money before governments even respond, that is the earliest measurable indicator of systemic exposure. Here's why that distinction matters so much. If the Revolutionary Guard is running autonomously, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't return to normal when diplomacy succeeds. It returns to normal when the autonomous military systems stop. Those are 2 completely different timelines, and right now, the markets are beginning to price that difference in. Most analysis is treating this like 2 governments in a standoff, but it isn't. It's a fragmented state with parallel power centers, and some of those centers simply cannot be reached by diplomacy. That is the architecture of the problem. And it didn't just emerge this week. This is a point that almost never gets the attention it deserves. The Revolutionary Guard was not built to be a conventional military. It was established in 1979 as a parallel revolutionary structure, deliberately positioned above the regular armed forces. Its core mission was to ensure the survival of the institution itself across any political transition, including transitions within the Islamic Republic. The Cold War parallel here is direct. In the final years of the Soviet Union, elements of the KGB and military intelligence operated with significant autonomy from Gorbachev's political authority. The 1991 hardliner coup attempt wasn't an accident. It was an institution activating the very logic it was built around. The Revolutionary Guard carries that same structural DNA. But here's what most of the coverage misses entirely. The Guard is not just a security force. It controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's formal economy. We're talking about construction, telecommunications, energy contracts, and import monopolies. That deep economic entrenchment creates survival incentives that are completely independent of any political directive coming from Tehran's transitional council. This is where the analysis gets more complex. The second historical parallel is Libya in 2003. When Gaddafi committed to dismantling his weapons program, Western governments treated that political agreement as operationally binding. But the parallel security structures, operating through their own institutional loyalties, didn't just dissolve because a deal was signed. The fragility that followed that deal contributed directly to the state's collapse in 2011. The consistent lesson is this. Government-level agreements do not produce institutional-level compliance when the institutions themselves have autonomous incentives to persist. Now, let's apply that to today. Iran's Transitional Council includes President Pezeshkian, the moderate who was conducting indirect negotiations in Muscat as recently as February 6th. Just one day before the current operations began, Oman's foreign minister confirmed what was described as a diplomatic breakthrough. Iran was apparently prepared to accept permanent enrichment limits and full international verification. That framework completely collapsed within 24 hours. This wasn't necessarily because of bad faith. It was because the gap between what the political leadership can commit to and what the institutional architecture will actually execute is structural. It isn't a negotiating position. It's a genuine constraint. President Pezeshkian can say yes, but he cannot make the Guard comply. And that gap is the central variable in every single scenario we're about to walk through. Let's first establish the current signals on the ground. Operations began on February 28th with coordinated strikes across Iranian military infrastructure. According to Central Command, over 1,000 targets have been confirmed struck: missile facilities, naval assets, and air defense systems. 4 American service members have been confirmed killed in action. Significant civilian casualties have been reported by Iranian humanitarian sources, and Israeli civilians have been killed in retaliatory strikes near Jerusalem. But here is the data point that surprised almost every analyst this week. Between February 15th and 20th, 10 days before operations even began, Iran increased its oil export volume to approximately 3 times its standard rate, while simultaneously reducing its domestic storage levels. That is not routine market behavior. That is a deliberate pre-positioning of export capacity before they expected sanctions to be reimposed. The scale of that preparation implies an operational awareness of an elevated conflict probability weeks in advance. The Guard knew something was coming, and they prepared economically before it arrived. Today, Iran's foreign ministry confirmed that units are executing pre-programmed autonomous instructions. The IRGC-aligned figure, who U.S. intelligence assesses as directing the current response, has specifically denied any institutional movement toward resuming diplomatic talks. At the same time, Israel has expanded its strikes into Lebanese territory, targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. The geographic scope of this conflict expanded from Iran to Lebanon within 72 hours. That escalation is not receiving the analytical weight that it truly deserves. Now let's look at the actors, each one separately. The United States entered this with 3 declared objectives: a permanent end to nuclear enrichment, constraints on Iran's missile program, and the termination of its proxy support networks. All 3 of these objectives require the Revolutionary Guard's compliance at an institutional level. Here in Washington, congressional war powers resolutions are scheduled for votes this week. They won't reach the threshold needed to override a veto, but the legislative record they create will have accountability implications that will outlast this current operational window. This situation is evolving faster than the headlines can keep up. What happens next depends not on negotiations between capitals, but on the internal mechanics of a fractured state. Now, the less obvious connection, and this one matters. China accumulated Iranian oil stockpiles at discounted rates through 3 years of sanctions arbitrage. Those stockpiles are now a structural cost advantage at exactly the moment Western competitors absorb $115 crude. Every additional week at current intensity widens the manufacturing energy cost differential between China and its primary economic competitors. Here is the connection most analysis doesn't make: that energy cost asymmetry directly expands Beijing's monetary policy space. When your domestic input costs are structurally lower than your competitors, your central bank has more room to maintain accommodative positions. That flexibility is a strategic benefit that lasts for the duration of the conflict. China's optimal scenario is a conflict sustained long enough to impose compounding costs on Western economies, but not so severe it collapses global demand for Chinese exports. Russia's positioning serves 3 simultaneous purposes: sovereignty defense framing useful for the Ukrainian context, deeper coordination architecture with Tehran, and a signal to Gulf actors that an alternative security relationship exists. Direct military assistance Russia can provide is limited. The diplomatic and intelligence coordination is operationally real. 7 NATO members have issued formal statements opposing the operation itself, not the Iranian government. Not since 2003 has Allied institutional fracture reached this level. The EU faces a structural vulnerability that is not fully priced into current analysis. It cannot absorb a compounding energy shock following the Russian gas disruption. An extended strait closure would push European industrial energy costs into recessionary territory within a single quarter. That produces EU institutional pressure for settlement at a pace and on terms Washington currently finds politically uncomfortable. That transatlantic divergence is not a marginal complication. It compounds the resolution challenge. Here is the reframe that changes how to read all of the above. This situation is producing a stress test on a foundational assumption of the post-2008 global energy architecture. The assumption that physical supply disruption can be managed through coordinated strategic reserve deployment. That assumption was designed for symmetric exposure. The current configuration is deeply asymmetric. China prepared. The United States and Europe did not. A 4 to 6 week strait closure imposes structurally different costs on different blocks. That asymmetry accelerates the decoupling trajectory that has been building since 2018. At a compression rate no existing framework had modeled. On sanctions architecture. Dollar primacy in global energy settlement is what makes U.S. financial sanctions function as a policy instrument. Each conflict episode that normalizes non-dollar energy trade reduces that structural leverage. An extended conflict that embeds alternative settlement as routine practice could measurably reduce sanctions effectiveness over an 18-month horizon. That is the slow-moving consequence that receives almost no attention in current coverage. On monetary policy. The Federal Reserve now faces stagflationary input. Energy-driven inflation above target at a moment requiring rate stability is the configuration central banks have the least room to manage. The 1973 parallel is not cosmetic. It shaped the institutional frameworks still in use today. On bloc formation. Coordinated condemnations from Pakistan, North Korea, Oman, and global South governments are early-stage alignment signals. They translate into institutional positioning over 2 to 3 years. Sustained conflict compresses that timeline and reduces the structural authority of the multilateral frameworks through which U.S. influence has historically operated. The core finding: what began as a targeted operation is generating compounding effects across energy markets, monetary policy, sanctions architecture, alliance cohesion, and geopolitical bloc formation simultaneously. These effects interact. They don't resolve independently, and most have timelines substantially beyond the publicly projected operational window. 3 scenarios. Low probability. Rapid resolution requires 3 simultaneous conditions. IRGC autonomous systems overridden or run to completion. Transitional Council achieves unified negotiating authority. United States accepts a settlement below all 3 declared objectives, all 3 at once. That convergence has low structural probability, medium probability. Tactical intensity reduction, not resolution, reached within 4 weeks, framed by both sides as strategic pause. IRGC activity continues at reduced scale. Partial strait navigation resumes under naval escort. Indirect talks reconvene without formal preconditions. Congressional oversight creates accountability structure. Both governments manage domestic audiences through partial success framing. Underlying tensions unresolved. High probability under current trends. Operations extend beyond 4 weeks. IRGC autonomous activity sustains insurance disruption without triggering complete strait closure. Oil consolidates between $110 and $125. Legislative oversight creates record without operational impact. European pressure produces no material trajectory change. China widens its energy cost advantage. The conflict embeds as a persistent, low-intensity pressure system in global market expectations through year-end. The question this analysis leads to next: if the Revolutionary Guard is genuinely running on autonomous, pre-programmed architecture and durable resolution, requires Guard compliance that the transitional government structurally cannot guarantee, what mechanism short of comprehensive neutralization of that autonomous command infrastructure produces a stable endpoint? And what does that neutralization cost the regional stability architecture surrounding it? That is where this goes next.